In March 1965, just as they were getting ready to release their new single, For Your Love, the Yardbirds suffered something of a setback. Their star guitarist, Eric Clapton, had decided to leave the group as he felt the band were straying too far from their original blues roots in order to obtain success in the pop charts. Now, normally a guitarist with the immense talent, musical presence and stature of Eric Clapton leaving your band would obviously be a bit of a blow, but the Yardbirds happened to know a guitarist with qualities that perhaps could actually match Clapton's. Jimmy Page was a prolific session guitarist, well known to the band's manager, Giorgio Gomelski, and friend of Clapton's. Encountering him at various times around the London music scene, Gomelski approached Page and asked him to join the Yardbirds with an offer of £25 a week. For context, a living wage at this time in the UK was considered to be around £10 a week. Page, however, was making around £80 a week doing session work, so was loath to drop it all to go and join a band, especially one that his friend Eric Clapton had just left. So instead he recommended this other fella that he knew, his other friend who could play guitar, a bloke called Jeff. Jeff Beck had met Jimmy Page when they were both teenagers. Beck's sister Annette noticed that there was this kid in her class that was just as obsessive over guitars as her brother was, so she introduced them to each other. "There's this weirdo in my class who's got a funny looking guitar just like yours," she said. Beck took his homemade guitar round to Page's house, and it turns out he also had a homemade guitar, and they just clicked instantly, like long lost brothers. Page had no hesitation recommending his friend for the gig. Beck had been playing in an R&B band called the Tridents, and had done some session work as well in 1964, though nothing like to the extent that Page had done it. Beck remembers being at Page's house one day, and they were listening to the song 5 Long Years by the Yardbirds on their LP, 5 Live Yardbirds, with Clapton on lead guitar, and Page dropped a bit of a hint. Would you ever play in a band like this? Well, the answer, it turned out, was yeah. After being accosted by Gomelski at a Tridents gig at the 100 Club, Beck decided to join the band just as the single For Your Love was being released on the 5th of March. When Jeff Beck turned up for his first audition/rehearsal with the band, the 4 other Yardbirds quickly realised what a different proposition Jeff Beck was going to be compared to Clapton. Showing up in oil-stained jeans, presumably having just worked on his car, with scruffy hair, Beck also had a very relaxed attitude when it came to playing the music. "I didn't like them when I first met them," Beck said later. "They didn't say hi or anything. They just seemed pissed off that Eric had left." As soon as Beck started playing the guitar, though, the band knew they had found their man. Not only could he play all the Eric stuff, said drummer Jim McCarty, but also a lot more. Beck demonstrated his rockabilly and his jazzy Les Paul style licks, and they had their minds blown. Here was the opposite of the studious purist approach that Clapton had embodied. Beck, it seemed, was completely open to experimentation. Both parties were happy with this outcome. "They didn't want to hear me play definitive blues," said Beck later. "They wanted this nutter with this guitar making all these weird noises, and that was alright with me." He did have to smarten himself up a bit though. Sartorially, by his own admission, Beck was bad. I mean bad. A mess, he said. Guitarist Chris Dreyer was given the urgent task of taking Beck to one of London's finest gentleman outfitters to get him into a suit pronto. Gomelski also noted the difference in temperament when Jeff joined the band. "He had this emotional thing that Eric just didn't," he said later. Where Clapton had kept his emotions to himself, Jeff's were always on display. If he was unhappy, they would soon know about it. With For Your Love, the band achieved the hit single they had been desperately hoping for. It climbed to number 3 in the UK, and even more impressively, a month later it hit number 6 in the USA, which meant that a US tour was a very likely possibility at some point in the near future. More than just a throwaway pop song, For Your Love was startlingly modern and different for its time, kicking off with epic gothic sounding chords played on a harpsichord. The song bounces along through the verse and chorus until it reaches the middle section where everything stops and then suddenly some pounding drums kick in and the band explode into a short, rough and ready passage of invigorating garage rock before returning to the harpsichord-led verse and chorus section. This was prog pop, way before prog rock. The Yardbirds couldn't have chosen a better song to kick off this portion of their career. On the day that the single was released, Jeff Beck made his first appearance with the band as they played at Fairfields Hall in Croydon. "Where's Eric?" shouted a disgruntled audience member. "Read the papers," shouted Beck. "He's gone." A few days later, when they played the Marquee in London, a young physics student and guitar enthusiast by the name of Brian was there to see how the Yardbirds would do without Eric Clapton. That young physics student was Brian May. Beck blew the future guitar legend's mind. "Jeff became a huge influence on me," May said later. "I couldn't believe what he could do. I remember he put the guitar down, he made it feed back and play a whole tune without even touching the fretboard. I'll never forget that." With a hit single came the pressure for an equally successful follow-up. So the band again chose a Graham Gouldman song called Heartful of Soul. As the novelty of using a harpsichord so prominently on their previous single had paid off so well, Giorgio Gomelski wanted an even more exotic instrument for this song. Gomelski brought in an Indian sitar player and a tabla player to play the song's signature riff, and had this arrangement of the song been released, it would have predated the Beatles' Norwegian Wood by 6 months. However, because the sitar didn't quite sit properly in the mix, instead Beck borrowed Jimmy Page's fuzzbox, still a quite recent invention at the time, rarely used in pop music, and emulated a sitar-like sound by playing the open D string with the melody on the G string of his guitar. It still sounded suitably exotic, but with an added boost of power that cut through the mix. Heartful of Soul is one of the band's greatest achievements, an absolutely killer song, masterfully arranged, melancholic and mean at the same time. Appearing just weeks after the Rolling Stones' Satisfaction, the song also played a major part in popularising the distorted fuzz guitar sound, which in time would not just prove to be a passing novelty, but the very basis of whole genres and subgenres of rock. The B-side was Steeled Blues, a slow blues that featured superb harmonica from Keith Relf and equally superb slide guitar by Beck, with Beck getting a wah-wah style effect on his guitar, but without the use of a pedal, just by using the tone knob on the guitar, which is just one of the many guitar-related things he was already a master of at the age of 20. Released in the June of '65, Heartful of Soul was an even bigger hit than the previous single, peaking at number 2 in the UK charts. Having now had 2 actual hit singles, the Yardbirds, in the summer of 1965, were fully legit pop stars. Now, Gomelski made sure to keep their schedule filled up to capitalise as much as possible on this newfound success, saying yes to every available chance of promoting the band in any way, any TV appearance, any gig, anywhere. He even had them running around a field dressed in medieval costumes for their For Your Love promo film. And with Beck on board, the band's live performances went up a few notches. Unlike the physically reserved Clapton, Jeff Beck wasn't afraid of on-stage theatrics, playing the guitar behind his head, using feedback as part of the show, throwing in musical quotes into his solos, dazzling the audience with his improvisational abilities, all delivered at extreme high volume for maximum impact. The new lineup of the Yardbirds stunned audiences in France at Paris's Olympia Theatre on the 20th of June, where they played a show with the Beatles and apparently incited a full-blown stage invasion at Richmond's Jazz and Blues Festival in August. Also in August, the band released the 5 Yardbirds EP, containing songs recorded during the first recording sessions featuring Jeff Beck on the guitar. A cover of the Vibrations song My Girl Sloopy, Mose Allison's I'm Not Talking, and I Ain't Done Wrong, which, although credited to Keith Relf as the songwriter, is basically a version of Elmore James' Must Have Done Somebody Wrong. My Girl Sloopy is a fun 5-minute version of the song, complete with playful guitar from Beck and multiple mini rave-ups. The song had recently been a huge hit in the United States, where it was known as Hang On Sloopy, as done by the McCoys. But the two other songs on this EP were on another level. I'm Not Talking takes Mose Allison's cool jazzy original and straps a couple of jet engines to it, giving it a loose, frenetic energy that showcases Beck's wild, fuzzed-up guitar. But it's also a fantastic display of the other band members' very much underrated ability as musicians. In particular, bassist Paul Samwell Smith and drummer Jim McCarty are flying along with Beck, seemingly untethered, but always managing to land back in the exact right place for the start of the next verse. I Ain't Done Wrong is even more dramatic, right from the start, with Beck's aggressive opening guitar stabs and the propulsive stop-start drums. Relf's harmonica and Beck's slide guitar call back and forth to each other so effortlessly that it's hard to believe that this was the first time in a recording studio that the pair had ever spent together. The instrumental section then comes in with the Yardbirds' most proto-metal riffing to date, which the whole band emphasises as well, building it up into a rave-up before coming back down again to end the song. What's brilliant about Beck's guitar here is, as well, like on Steeled Blues, he's still adjusting the tone knob to give it a slight wah-wah effect in the middle of a rave-up during the Proto-Metal Riffage, which is pretty insane. Meanwhile, across the pond, For Your Love and Heart Full of Soul were top 10 hits in the USA, so they cobbled together an album compiling their A and B sides, plus the songs from the 5 Yardbirds EP. They titled the album For Your Love, and it managed to scrape into the top 100. So Gomelsky arranged a tour of the USA. They flew out to New York from Heathrow in early September 1965. Things, however, didn't quite go according to plan. Leaving New York to go and do their first gig in Oklahoma, admin problems with their work visa meant the band were not actually allowed to perform, so instead they did a tour of radio stations doing awkward last-minute interviews to promote the band. As the band were due to visit Memphis, but without a gig to play there, Gomelsky somehow managed to get Sam Phillips on the phone and told him the Yardbirds were coming to do some recording at Sun Studio, the birthplace of rock and roll, and unbelievably, said Chris Dreyer, he went for it. Sun Records truly was the melting pot that changed music history. Howlin' Wolf, Elvis, Jerry Lee Lewis, Johnny Cash, Roy Orbison were all launched into the world from Phillips' studio at 706 Union Avenue, Memphis, Tennessee. By 1965, Phillips was no longer releasing records like he used to, but still getting the Yardbirds to make a record with him at Sun Studio was a massive coup for Gomelsky and a dream come true for the band members. We were listening to the playback through the same speakers that Elvis had heard his songs being played through, Jeff Beck said. It was like, come on. One of the songs that they recorded at Sun was suggested by Beck, an old jump blues song by Tiny Bradshaw called Train Kept A-Rollin', a favourite of Beck's. It had been covered and turned into a rockabilly classic later by the Johnny Burnett Trio in 1956. In the hands of the Yardbirds, the song evolved further into a super heavy proto-metal banger, with the band leaning into the 1956's version's riff, fuzzing and beefing it up, and adding their trademark rave-up sections. Beck also emulated the sound of a train whistle on his guitar for the song's intro. Keith Relf provided probably the loosest and most chaotic vocal performance yet, double tracking himself but singing two different vocal lines, only adding to this sort of sense of feverish excitement. Sam Phillips himself was mightily impressed by the band, not so much with Relf though. Sam didn't really take to Keith, McCarty said later, mainly because Keith was drunk. Unfortunate really, but Keith, well, Keith liked to drink. Drink, it seems, was Relf's default refuge from the pressures of life in a now successful band, which, given his health struggles, was not ideal. However, in defence of Relf, Beck stated later that he didn't really understand the animosity coming from Phillips to Ralph. Looking back, he said, what we sounded like must have been frightening to him on some level, like the Sex Pistols arriving. He added that Phillips probably hadn't adjusted to Rolling Stones-itis just yet. The Yardbirds version of Train Kept A-Rollin' is 3 minutes of sheer unabashed joy, abandoned chaos and energy that simply wouldn't be possible without the tightly wound rhythmical engine of McCarthy, Dreyer and Samwell Smith, which allowed Ralph and Beck the freedom to fly all over the top of them. When future bands like Aerosmith and Motorhead covered this song, it would be the Yardbirds version that they would emulate. In fact, nothing represents better the Yardbirds' place in the history of rock and roll better than their version of Train Kept A-Rollin'. A blues song turned into a rockabilly song turned into a proto-metal hard rock song. Their version perfectly demonstrates how they were the bridge between the blues and rock and roll of the 50s and the hard rock, metal and punk of the future. They also recorded another new song at Sun, Mr. You're a Better Man Than I, a very different song written by brothers Mike and Brian Hugg. Mike Hugg was a founding member of Manfred Mann. The song was much more a contemporary folk rock type of song, with conscientious lyrics that ask a series of rhetorical questions. Can you judge someone by the way they dress, by the way they speak, or by the colour of their skin? To which the sarcastic answer is, well then you're a better man than I. The Yardbirds' restrained, moody arrangement perfectly suits the subject matter, and it shows just how great the band was at building tension and then releasing it. The instrumental section slowly gathers intensity as Beck's fuzz solo reaches a higher and higher pitch until it peaks, and then the tension dissipates again before going back into the next verse. A few days later the band got to Chicago, and just like they had done in Memphis, Gomelsky arranged for them to go straight to the source, Chess Studios. The Chess Studio and Chess Records were synonymous with Chicago blues, Muddy Waters, Bo Diddley, Chuck Berry, Willie Dixon, and many more that had caused the British R&B boom to explode in the first place. Like at Sun, the band didn't waste any time and chose to record their version of Bo Diddley's I'm a Man. They had previously captured the song with Eric Clapton on guitar on the album 5 Live Yardbirds, but with Jeff Beck now, the song had evolved. They had always played the song at a much higher tempo than the original slow blues stomp. If the original was a stately Cadillac, this was a V8 Mustang. With brilliant interplay between all the band members right from the start, the band managed to capture the essence of their best live performances in this 2.5 minutes at Chess Studios. For the first 1.5 minutes, the band is at their most blues wailing best, with Ralph's voice and harmonica never sounding better, blending and interacting with Beck's guitar, building to an intense thrashing rave up before returning to the original riff. Paul Samwell Smith outdoes himself on the bass with a cheeky little high note after the rave up. But then, around 1 minute and 28 seconds, things abruptly just die down before you hear, in my opinion, one of the most iconic moments in rock and roll history. Jeff Beck smashing his foot down on his tone bender fuzz pedal, and then what follows after that is astonishing. Jim McCarthy doubles the tempo of the beat, Samwell Smith and Dreyer vamp on one note and one chord, and Beck and Ralph begin a call and response between guitar and harmonica that climbs in intensity until, with seemingly nowhere else to go, Beck goes so high up the neck that he's no longer playing notes, high-pitched chicken scratching noises, and the band sustains this manic energy longer than you would think possible before Beck and Samwell Smith both go back down their necks to thrash the one chord at the low end again, shredding the song into a brutal climax that ends with the band brilliantly, somehow, all finishing together cleanly on a couple of rhythmical stabs. After recording the song, upon hearing the playback in the studio, Beck says, "We went berserk. The bass drum was shaking the foundation of the building. There was just so much excitement there. Unlike anything that had ever been put down on tape before." The closing section of the song goes beyond all the conventions of R&B, rock and roll and pop music of the time, having more in common with jazz or experimental music. Predating the Velvet Underground's Sister Ray by more than 2 years, the Yardbirds, whether by accident or design, now found themselves at the forefront of experimentation in pop music, the same year that Bob Dylan and the Beatles were also tearing down down the barriers between pop music and the avant-garde. Meanwhile, Gomelsky managed to get the problems with the work visas sorted out, so the band was able to perform in Chicago and Phoenix, and then on to Los Angeles, where the band suffered serious culture shock when entering LA through the district of Watts. The neighborhood and surrounding areas had experienced widespread rioting just a few weeks earlier due to the residents' anger at the racist and abusive LAPD at the time. 5 days of rioting, looting and arson had left streets full of smashed windows and still smouldering cars, which the band saw through their tour bus window. America was unreal to us, Chris Dreyer said. We didn't really know there was segregation and bad treatment. Our understanding of that only came when we saw it for ourselves. Gomelsky was also shocked by the ignorance displayed by the American record executives he'd met on the trip. When we said we wanted to go to Chicago to see Muddy Waters, he said, they said, "Who? We never heard of him." Beverly Hills also shocked the band as much as Watts had, only for very different reasons. It was sunny, and there was like 17 and 18-year-old girls driving around in convertible cars, said Beck. It truly was the land of milk and honey and smog. Beck took to LA like a duck to water, renting a Corvette to go racing up and down the Sunset Strip, living out a Hollywood Technicolor fantasy in real life. It wasn't all plain sailing though. Beck's guitar, the blonde Fender Esquire, was apparently stolen, but not for long, as the LAPD managed to recover it just in time for the Yardbirds' appearance on the TV show Shindig, performing For Your Love and Heartful of Soul. Due to the previous issue with the work visas, the band only played one date in LA, but Gomelsky got around this by securing them a gig at a party in a mansion in the Hollywood Hills. The house was owned by the oil tycoon, father of Bob Markley, who was soon to form his band, the West Coast pop art experimental band. Gomelsky had met Markley through Kim Fowley, who was seemingly involved with all and any countercultural shenanigans that were going on in LA around this time. The party turned out to be the archetypal groovy 60s Austin Powers style party, and the Yardbirds were the house band. The audience was full of artists, filmmakers, celebrities and musicians. There were rumours Marlon Brando and Bob Dylan would show up. It's not clear whether they did, but definitely in attendance were Jim McGuinn of the Byrds and the comedian Lenny Bruce, who for some reason threw a shoe out of a window that hit Jim McCarthy as he was loading his drums into a van. Jeff Beck, who preferred women rather than drugs or alcohol as an escape from the pressures of touring, met a stunning blonde Hollywood B-movie starlet at the party called Mary Hughes, who was known for her big roles in beach party movies. They began a relationship, but much to Jeff's disappointment, the Yardbirds had to go back home again. But it wasn't the last time that Beck and Hughes would get together, as we will see. For now though, despite the visa issues and lack of gigs, the US visit had been a success, appearing on TV twice, cementing the band's status as transatlantic pop stars. The band's mentality was also significantly altered by the trip, having now been introduced to the new LA rock scene and also being made aware of the psychedelic goings on in San Francisco with bands like the Jefferson Airplane and the Grateful Dead. Back in the UK, the Yardbirds released a new double A-side single, Evil Hearted You and Still I'm Sad, the first being another classic minor chord Graham Gouldman song with bold twanging guitar and a brilliant slide solo that swung and swaggered like a cross between a Morricone score and the James Bond theme. Still I'm Sad represented a major departure, not only the band's first completely self-written hit, but unlike anything they had done before, with an almost Gregorian chant style vocal and mournful guitar swells. It was about as far away from R&B as you could possibly get, but nevertheless, critics loved it and the fans loved it. It still sounds like nothing else today, actually, and was a very important contribution to the development of what would soon come to be called psychedelic music. With their innovations from the rave up to their latest 3 singles, the Yardbirds would prove to be a huge source of inspiration for many aspiring to reach psychedelic heights, especially in America. The double A-sided single reached number 3 in the UK charts in October, whilst the band went out on tour at just slightly less glamorous locations such as Grantham and Cleethorpes. The touring for the remainder of '65 was relentless, with almost constant gigs around the UK until the beginning of December, when, after a few days off, the band went back to the USA, this time playing a real run of dates in 12 different states, which would take them through to January 1966. Since their last visit, their version of I'm a Man, recorded at the Chess Studios in September, had been released as a single in the US and gotten to number 17, making their Insane Rave Up a top 20 hit. A second cobbled together album was also released in the US, the magnificently named Having a Rave Up with the Yardbirds, which sold well over the coming year. Essentially another compilation. It contained 4 songs from 5 live Yardbirds with Clapton on guitar. It had the recent singles, it had Train Kept a Rollin', I'm a Man and Mr. You're a Better Man Than I, making this LP a must-have for the many thousands of teenage garage bands newly obsessed with the possibilities of the electric guitar. I'm a Man in particular became a garage rock staple, or garage rock if you're American. The Yardbirds' supercharged performance becoming the definitive version to emulate. Wayne Kramer, for example, of the MC5, said, "We were deeply influenced by this record, and together we learned almost every song. The rave-up parts were my favourite. It was the sound of liberation. Jeff Beck prepped me for free jazz," he said, adding that 60 years later it still gave him goosebumps. Lester Bangs, the critic who was a key influence on defining the genre of punk in the 70s, wrote, "The Yardbirds were incredible. They just came stampeding in and blew everyone clean off the tracks. Little Tino groups everywhere immediately recorded wind-up versions of I'm a Man to fill out their debut albums, taking the Yardbirds sound and reducing it to this kind of goony fuzztone clatter." He cites one example as the Count Five's Psychotic Reaction, which lifted the rave-up section from the Yardbirds song and was a bigger hit than I'm a Man was in the US. During their second trip to the US, they returned to Chess Studios in Chicago to record another song. This time it was Shapes of Things, another original song co-written by Samwell Smith, McCarthy and Ralph, partly based on an old Dave Brubeck jazz riff. The song is perhaps the Yardbirds' greatest moment, a fusion of all their disparate strands, the R&B, the rave-up, the proto-metal, psychedelia, tempo changes, and contemporary conscientious lyrics, a brain-melting guitar solo, and feedback, all delivered in a 2.5-minute gut punch. The heaviest and most psychedelic rock on the planet at that moment was recorded in none other than the Chess Studio in Chicago. Beck said he was frustrated with the limits of his guitar for the solo. He ended up playing it on just one string, the G string. "I wanted the bends to sound like Buddy Guy," he said, "but it was hellish work." All these years later, Shapes of Things remains an absolute mind-bender, sharing the same military type marching beat as I'm a Man, this time brilliantly underscoring the lyrical theme. The band effortlessly switched from the shuffle to the straight 4/4 between verse and chorus, before blasting off into space with a dramatic, feedback-drenched solo section with rolling drums, Beck's raga-esque bent notes, ending the solo with a huge, distorted power chord, taking them back into the one final verse. The song even ends like no other song, simply vamping on one note until it sort of fades away, Beck's guitar still howling with feedback. The lyrics begged those in power to not destroy these lands, don't make them desert sands, whilst worrying about what the future held. Come tomorrow, maybe older, come tomorrow, maybe a soldier. It resonated with youth on both sides of the Atlantic, hitting number 3 and number 11 respectively in the UK and US when the single was released a few months later. As the band continued their tour of the US, they soaked in the insanity of it all. The touring was mad, Chris Dreyer said. Strange situations. Sometimes you get on a plane and find yourself seated next to a dead deer. From the West Coast back to New York, the Yardbirds had established themselves in the US. But not only that, we were at the forefront of the psychedelic thing, Beck said later. Some would say we had even invented it. Now, as was alarmingly common in early rock history, money began to become an issue. As the band members noted that their popularity was rocketing, with attendance at gigs and record sales going through the roof, they still didn't seem to be seeing an increase in financial terms. As brilliant a publicist and visionary Giorgio Gomulski was, he didn't quite have the knack for managing the stream of cash that was now flowing into the band's coffers. Gomulski also annoyed the band by entering the band at their Italian label's request into the San Remo Song Festival, some sort of Eurovision style contest. They recorded and performed 2 terrible songs for it called Questa Volta and Paf Bum. Yeah, Paf Bum. That's what the song was called. Gomulski's quality control with this was lax, to say the least, and Beck even refused to play on the cheesy Questa Volta, and maybe the others should have too, because it's just shite. During their next round of recording sessions, Paul Samuel Smith, musical director of course, decided to lead a revolt against Gomulski, and the band fired their manager, and he agreed to leave, with one stipulation: that he retained the rights to all the recordings he had produced for them. The band, in their naivety, agreed to this, something that they would later regret, as in the subsequent years, the Yardbirds, Jeff Beck's and Eric Clapton's reputations as musical trailblazers only grew larger, and their back catalogue from the period just grew more and more valuable, and for years Gomulski made an absolute fortune due to his ownership of the Yardbirds 64 to 66 catalogue. So, with the rest of 1966 still ahead of them, how would the band fare now that their larger-than-life mentor, master publicist and manager was out of the picture? Would the band's growing reputation as fearless pioneers continue to carry them commercially? Would they be able to stop Jeff Beck from running away to California to be with his insanely hot new girlfriend? Well, we'll take a look at all that in the next part, coming soon to this very channel. So please subscribe to the Deep Dive Archive. But that's all from me on this one. Bye for now.